Is Mercedes now Red Bull's closest challenger in F1? We use the term challenger loosely, given that Max Verstappen can pretty much choose how much he wants to win by at the moment, but while there's little sign of Red Bull being properly pushed anytime soon, the battle for best of the rest is constantly changing. It's a fascinating scrap, so who has the upper hand right now? The case for Mercedes looked pretty convincing at the Spanish Grand Prix. Lewis Hamilton and George Russell comfortably saw off any threat from Ferrari and Aston Martin to claim the two podium spots behind dominant winner Verstappen. And Russell managed that despite starting 12th on the grid, with Aston Martin team boss Mike Crack saying Russell drove through us. So is this a sign that the major updates made to the W14, which we've covered previously in depth on our channel, are already making a difference? The changes are clearly working, but it would be wrong to assume that they made a transformative difference on the first conventional track Mercedes has been able to run this package at. Much of Mercedes' formidable race pace compared to Ferrari and Aston Martin was down to the specific demands of the Barcelona track, one where even last year's troubled W13 looked pretty good. This year, the relative race performance of any car that wasn't a Red Bull was largely down to tyre life. The Mercedes looks after its tyres well, the Ferrari doesn't even know the meaning of tyre management, and Aston Martin had a confusing weekend which we'll cover in more detail later. The Mercedes also performs better in cooler temperatures, and the cloudy conditions at Barcelona last weekend allowed the team to play to its strengths. It sacrificed some outright single lap performance by adding more wing to its cars, but that extra downforce helped it look after its tyres superbly in the race. None of this is to take away from the progress Mercedes is making. It will be learning about its new car specification at a frightening rate at the moment, and will have got a lot more out of running it at Barcelona than it did in Monaco. Regardless of the strain put through the tyres on this track, which is even greater now the fiddly chicane at the end of the lap has been consigned to forgettable history, it's always been one of the truest tests of what a car can do, so Mercedes has plenty of reasons to be optimistic. It didn't get anywhere near Red Bull, but nobody is doing that right now, and even if Verstappen could have won by twice or three times the margin he did in Spain, there's a feeling that Mercedes has at least made up a couple of tenths on Red Bull's massive advantage. We need to see the W14 on a wider range of tracks to see if Mercedes has made a real step forwards, or if Barcelona was a track that played to its strengths and its main competitors' weaknesses. But if this is a sign of Mercedes finally making genuine progress, it's just increased the pressure on Ferrari and Aston Martin. Aston Martin left Spain without any obvious answers for why it had its most disappointing weekend of the season. The fact that only finishing 6th and 7th looks like a bad result is testament to how much progress the team has made since last year, but with Mercedes and Ferrari making significant changes to their flawed cars in recent weeks, is this a sign that Fernando Alonso's early run of podiums were assisted by the competition being off the boil, and could Aston Martin be shuffled to the back of the chasing pack as the 4th fastest team? To get some more perspective on that, we asked our very own Ed Straw, who was at the Grand Prix, to fill us in.
Barcelona was without question the weakest weekend of the season for Aston Martin. Even then, Fernando Alonso could have been second on the grid. In fact, I think he would have been, but for the fact he had that Q1 off. But even if he'd started second, no chance of beating the Mercedes. The Mercedes was working the tyres really well. The Aston Martin just wasn't, so didn't have the race pace, particularly on the soft tyres. Alonso's race was about ensuring he stayed clear of those midfielders and working his way forward. He could have beaten Lance Stroll. I think he was fundamentally quicker than Stroll, but he pragmatically stayed behind because Sainz was a bit further up the road. I think with a more normal starting position, the battle with Sainz would have been much more interesting. But certainly Aston Martin will be looking at Mercedes and thinking, yeah, this could be quite tricky, but they've never thought anything different. They've got ambitious upgrade plans. They want to bring more and more parts to the car to help maintain the lofty position, so they know they've got to work hard. But I'm sure we'll see many more podiums from this team. The Aston Martin's still a strong package. So, yeah, some reason for concern, but I don't think any reason for panic. They know Mercedes is a tough opposition, and Ferrari, frankly, still very, very beatable for them.
So according to Ed, it's not all doom and gloom for Aston Martin. Team boss Mike Crack said the first stint on the soft tyres was the part of the race that was really puzzling, and he accepted that Aston Martin's deficit during the opening part of the Grand Prix was quite substantial. He agreed with Ed's assessment that even if Alonso had started ahead of the Mercedes drivers, he wouldn't have stayed there. Crack estimated that Mercedes was more than half a second per lap faster in the first stint, and even if the Aston Martin looked better on the harder tyres later in the race, by then the story of its afternoon was set. When it was suggested that Mercedes updates could explain the performance swing, Crack disagreed, saying his team's initial analysis didn't reflect that theory. Alonso was less positive about the car's late race speed, saying that he felt Aston Martin was just slow on Sunday regardless of which tyre it was running. This looked like the first weekend where things didn't go to plan for Aston Martin. Alonso said the track didn't seem to suit the car and the team was surprised to end up needing a completely different setup to what it had expected before the weekend. Elsewhere this year, Alonso said the team was always happy with the car from Friday morning, but it took more work in Spain. One thing we'd agree with Alonso on is his prediction that the battle behind Red Bull will keep swinging from race to race. And while Mercedes and Ferrari have thrown big updates at their cars in the last 2 races, Aston Martin has new things coming for next time out in Canada, a race Alonso is extremely optimistic about. While Carlos Sainz beat the Aston Martins in Spain, the feeling was that if Alonso had had a cleaner qualifying session and started closer to the front, he'd have been able to beat the only Ferrari that had a relevant weekend. We've already looked into Ferrari's troubles in depth in a separate video, so let's hear from Scott Mitchell-Malm, who was in Barcelona, to get his thoughts on the state of play for the team at the moment.
Ferrari certainly looked like it was going to be Red Bull's biggest title threat this season, especially when it started the year with about as fast a car in qualifying. The problem is, while that trend has continued, the car is still hopelessly inconsistent in races. It's not just track to track, but it's within a race weekend itself, and within a race itself, stint to stint. We saw that amplified at the Spanish Grand Prix, where Carlos Sainz and Charles Leclerc found themselves at a loss to explain why the car would be good at the start or middle of the race, but then bad at the end of the race, or vice versa. And sometimes it happens on the same set of tyre compounds, different set of tyres, but the same compound. So with Ferrari, the problem is not so much understanding where its strengths are, where Red Bull's strengths are, and how to catch that. At the moment, the biggest issue for Ferrari is not really understanding its weakness and how to address that. And that is a serious issue because it stops Ferrari from capitalising on clear potential in this package, which is why it is probably the second fastest car in Formula One over a single lap. But races aren't won or lost over a single lap. It happens over a Grand Prix distance. The problem for Ferrari, even though they've opened up this new development direction, and there could be great potential there that maybe leads them into a position to fight Red Bull on a Sunday later in the year or in 2024. It doesn't look particularly convincing at the moment. They seem a little bit lost. The confusion seems as great as ever, and it's hard to see them as a serious threat to Red Bull, certainly not as much as Mercedes.
Plenty of work for Ferrari to do then, and what was most worrying was that its heavily updated car produced exactly the same weekend pattern we've already seen this year, quick in qualifying and sliding back in the race. Team boss Fred Vasseur's verdict on the weekend was particularly downbeat. But Barcelona exaggerated Ferrari's weaknesses, particularly on tyre life, so it won't be out of the picture at every track. If Mercedes continues to make gains with its updated car and Aston Martin can prove that last weekend was just a blip, then Ferrari looks like the team with the most work to do in the battle to be best of the rest behind Red Bull.